Shaquille O'Neal, a basketball icon, a global name, racially profiled in his own neighborhood. But instead of staying silent, he turned that moment into a powerful stand for change. Watch how it all unfolded. Like, comment, and subscribe to be part of the movement. The day had been long, one of those grueling, mentally draining practices that stick with you, but as Shaquille O'Neal eased his brand new Lexus through the calm, winding roads of Silver Lake, he finally started to breathe again. Jazz hummed softly through the speakers, cool evening air drifted in through the cracked window, and for the first time all day, peace started to settle in. Silver Lake was quiet, wealthy, and peaceful, just the way he liked it. This was home now. He'd worked for every inch of it. From rough beginnings in the inner city to international fame, Shaq had seen it all. Every step of the way, he fought, on the court, in the system, against the doubts and the people who thought a man like him didn't belong in places like this. But he proved them wrong. He became a symbol of success and resilience, especially for young black men who saw in him what could be possible. And now, in this moment, cruising past million-dollar homes in a luxury car he bought with the sweat of decades, it felt like everything had finally lined up. Until it didn't. Out of nowhere, red and blue lights exploded in his rearview mirror. His stomach tightened. A police cruiser tailed him, lights flashing. Confused, Shaq checked his speed. He wasn't speeding. Not even close. His pulse picked up. He'd heard stories. Too many of them. But not here. Not in his neighborhood. He pulled over, slow and cautious. The peaceful evening shattered under the strobe of flashing lights. His hands gripped the wheel. Stay calm. Breathe. Remember who you are. A knock at the window made him jump. He turned. A tall, stone-faced officer stood at the driver's side. License and registration, she barked, no hello, no explanation. Just orders. Shaq complied, silently. She snatched the papers from his hand, barely looking at them. Then her eyes locked on him, scanning him with a sharp, unsettling stare. Step out of the car, she ordered. His heart skipped. Excuse me, he asked, confused but polite. Step out of the car, she repeated, louder this time, her hand resting on the gun at her hip. That's when it hit him. This wasn't a routine stop. This wasn't about a ticket. This was about him, what he looked like, not who he was. Fame meant nothing in this moment. He kept his voice calm. Ma'am, there must be some mistake. I'm Shaquille O'Neal. This is my car. I live just down the street. No flicker of recognition. No shift in tone. Just cold authority. Step out of the vehicle, Mr. O'Neal, she said again, her grip tightening on her holster. Or we're gonna have a problem. In that instant, Shaq realized this wasn't about the law. This was about power. About assumptions. About fear. And what he did next would define not just the moment, but the message he wanted to send to the world. Shaquille O'Neal, one of the most recognizable athletes in the world, stepped out of his own car, in his own neighborhood, and was treated like a suspect. What happened next will shake you. Like, comment, and subscribe to be part of this conversation. Shaquille slowly pushed open the door and stepped out, his movements calm but intentional. His heart pounded as Officer Drexler circled him, eyes sharp, like a predator sizing up prey. The once quiet street now felt suffocating, like the very air had turned against him. We've had reports of stolen vehicles in the area, she said coldly, her eyes flicking from Shaq to the Lexus. This car matches the description. His jaw tightened. This is my car. I bought it from the dealership just a few days ago. If you run the plates, it'll all check out. But her expression didn't shift. No reaction. No curiosity. Just quiet judgment. Hands on the hood, she ordered. Shaquille hesitated. Is this really necessary? He asked, his voice steady but full of disbelief. Hands on the Hood. Her tone sharpened as she stepped closer, hand still hovering near her weapon. Swallowing the frustration rising in his chest, he turned and placed his hands on the smooth metal. From the corner of his eye, he caught movement. Curtains shifting. Neighbors watching. Faces half hidden in shadows. The sting of humiliation hit harder than the cold steel. Then came the pat down. Mechanical. Rough. As if he'd already been convicted in her mind. "This car matches the one reported stolen last week," she said, her voice flat, almost bored. "I already told you," he replied, struggling to keep his anger in check. "This car is mine." But she wasn't listening. She didn't want to hear him. To her, he was just another black man in a nice car, and that was all she needed to assume the worst. Then her hand moved toward her cuffs. That's when Shaquille knew he had to take control, calmly, firmly. "Before you do something you'll regret," he said, eyes locked on hers, "I suggest you call your superior." Her hand froze mid-reach. For the first time, her confidence wavered. He stood his ground. "Run the plates. Call your captain. Do your job properly." The silence between them felt electric. Tense. Heavy. Finally, with a muttered curse under her breath, she reached for her radio. The gears of justice were finally starting to turn, but for Shaquille, the damage had already been done. There he stood, hand still on the hood, the evening sky now dim and tense, the weight of injustice pressing down on his shoulders. He could feel the eyes behind the windows. People watching. Judging. Whispering. This wasn't just a traffic stop, it was a performance. And he had been cast as the criminal. As Drexler fumbled with her radio, her stiff composure began to crack. And in that crack, Shaquille saw it, not fear of him, but fear of what this moment could mean for her. The consequences. The fallout. He thought of his wife, Maya. Of Michael and Olivia, their 2 kids. Of the talks he'd had with his son about moments like this, how to stay calm, stay safe, de-escalate, no matter how wrong the situation felt. He had hoped his life, his legacy, would be proof that a black man could rise above bias. That dignity and success could change how the world sees you. But standing there, reduced to a suspect, he realized just how deep that bias ran. He remembered Michael once asking, "Dad, does it ever get better? Do people ever stop seeing us like this?" Shaq hadn't known what to say. He wanted to protect his son's hope. So he told him to stay strong. Stay grounded. Never forget his worth. And yet here he was. Dignity stripped. Humanity ignored. Treated like a stranger in his own story. Seconds passed like hours. The radio crackled again. Officer Drexler tensed, listening. Shaquille couldn't hear the words, he didn't need to. Her face said it all. She'd made a mistake. A big one. After being racially profiled in his own neighborhood, Shaquille O'Neal faced the officer who made the call. What happened next was more than a conversation, it was a turning point. Like, comment, and subscribe to be part of the change. Shaquille turned slowly, lowering his hands from the hood of the car. His gaze locked onto Officer Drexler's, steady and unwavering. "Well," he asked, voice low but firm. Every word sharp. Controlled. Unmistakable. For a moment, she didn't answer. She just stared back, caught between embarrassment and stubborn pride. Her hand, still hovering near her radio, dropped to her side. She took a shaky step back and exhaled hard, as if trying to gather herself. But the damage had been done, and she knew it. There seems to have been a misunderstanding," she stammered, eyes avoiding his. Shaquille raised an eyebrow. His anger had been simmering this whole time, now it started to rise. "A misunderstanding," he repeated, his voice slicing through the silence. "That's what we're calling it?" Drexler shifted, clearly uncomfortable. I thought." "You thought what?" he cut in, his voice now harder. Still composed, but colder. "That I stole this car?" That I didn't belong in this neighborhood? That someone like me couldn't possibly own a Lexus? He stepped forward, slow, deliberate, commanding. His size alone cast a shadow over her, but his words were what carried the real weight. Tell me, officer, what exactly went through your mind when you pulled me over? Because I'd really like to understand how a man who's spent his whole life representing this city, who's given everything to this community, somehow became a threat just for driving down his own street. Her face turned bright red, but she stayed silent. There was no excuse she could give. Not one that would make any of this make sense. The silence between them was thick, uncomfortable. Then the low rumble of another engine broke it. A second police cruiser pulled up. Shaquille recognized the man stepping out, Captain Rivera. An older officer, graying at the temples, with a tired look that came from years of seeing too much and fixing too little. Shaquille, Rivera called out as he approached, urgency in his voice. I'm so sorry about this. We got the call and, well, clearly, this was a mistake. Shaquille folded his arms, his jaw clenched tight. Mistake, he repeated, bitterly. That's the word of the night, huh? Rivera stopped a few feet away, glancing at Drexler, who now stood stiff and silent, shame written all over her face. This is unacceptable, Rivera said, turning back to Shaquille. And it will be dealt with. Internally. Shaquille looked him dead in the eye, searching for something, anything, that resembled real accountability. Internally isn't enough, he said flatly. I want this addressed publicly. I want people to see that racial profiling has consequences. I want transparency. I want action. The captain hesitated, glancing again at Drexler, who looked like she wanted to disappear. Shaquille, I understand your frustration, but... No, you don't, Shaquille interrupted, calm but unwavering. You don't understand what it's like to live like this. To be seen like this. But I do. And so does every black man and woman who's ever been in this position. He took a breath, then added, if we don't do something now, if we don't hold people accountable, it's going to keep happening. Rivera swallowed hard, then nodded. You're right, he said quietly. You're absolutely right. Shaquille took a step back, exhaling slowly, the pressure in his chest loosening just a little. Then do something about it, he said. Rivera looked at him, then at Drexler, and finally nodded again. I will, Shaquille. I promise you, I will. But Shaquille had heard promises like that before. Empty words delivered after the damage was already done. As he stood there in the quiet, now surrounded by flashing lights and attention that refused to let go, he knew this wasn't just about him. This was about every person who'd ever been judged for the color of their skin instead of the content of their character. This was just the beginning of a much bigger fight. Shaquille turned and walked back to his car. No words. No farewell. Just the soft hum of the engine as he drove off into the night, the weight of what happened still heavy, but his mind already focused on what came next. Because this fight wasn't over. Not even close. The joyful jazz from earlier? Gone. Replaced by a heavy silence that followed Shaquille O'Neal all the way home. What should have been a normal evening ended up shaking something deep inside him. Stay with us, because this story isn't over. Like, comment, and subscribe to keep the conversation alive. The streets that once felt familiar now seemed distant, like he no longer belonged to them. The comfort, the routine, even the quiet charm of his neighborhood, it had all been tainted. It wasn't the first time he'd experienced racism. But tonight felt different. Maybe it was the setting, his own neighborhood, the place he was supposed to feel safe, respected. Maybe it was the sharp, undeniable truth that no matter how far he'd come, some people would always see him as less. Shaquille pulled into the driveway, the giant oak tree casting long shadows across the lawn. He sat there for a while, gripping the steering wheel, knuckles tight. His heart was still pounding, not from fear, but from a slow, simmering anger he'd learned to keep buried. He trained himself to channel that rage into the game, into discipline, into building a legacy that couldn't be denied. But tonight, it was harder to hold back. The porch light flickered on. Through the front window, he saw Maya moving through the kitchen, probably setting the table. She had no idea what had just happened. Maya had always been his anchor. Calm, steady, fiercely intelligent. But even with her, there were things he'd never fully put into words. How do you explain what it feels like to always be on guard? To know your skin alone can make you a target? Shaquille finally opened the door and stepped out. The cool air brushed against him, but it didn't soothe him. He looked at his home, the two-story house he dreamed of as a kid. Big windows, a tidy lawn, warm light glowing from inside. But right now, it all felt like a lie. You can build a beautiful life, earn every bit of it, and still be seen as a threat just for existing in it. He walked to the door, steps heavy. Just as he reached for the handle, it opened. Maya stood there, her face lighting up. "Hey, love," she smiled. "Dinner's almost ready. How was your day?" He hesitated, then forced a half smile. "Long," he said quietly. "I'll be right in. Just need a minute." But Maya knew him too well. She didn't miss the way his shoulders sagged or how his voice had lost its usual rhythm. "Shaquille," she said gently. "What happened?" He sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "I got pulled over." Her brows drew together. "For what?" He looked her in the eyes. "Racial profiling. Officer thought I stole my own car." Maya's face hardened instantly. "Are you serious? Here? In this neighborhood? Who was it?" "Officer Drexler," he replied, walking into the kitchen. "Didn't ask any questions. Just treated me like I was some criminal until her captain showed up." Maya followed, her voice sharp with anger. "You're one of the most respected athletes in this city. How dare they?" "It doesn't matter," Shaquille said, cutting her off softly. "None of that matters when they see my skin first." Silence. She knew he was right. As successful as their life had become, neither of them were immune. Maya had fought her own battles, constantly underestimated, dismissed, judged. "What are you going to do?" she asked, voice quieter now but still steady. He leaned against the kitchen counter, eyes on the floor. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "Captain said they'll handle it internally. But that's not enough. I need to do something real. Something that matters. This can't keep happening. Not to me. Not to anyone." Maya stepped close, placing a hand on his arm. "Whatever you decide. I've got you. Always." He nodded, grateful. But the weight of it all still sat heavy on his chest. He had spent his life pushing for fairness, not just in sports, but everywhere. He'd become a voice, a leader, a role model. But tonight he was reminded that even the strongest voices can be silenced by the sound of bias. Later that night, after dinner, after the kids had been tucked into bed, Shaquille sat alone in his study. The soft glow of his desk lamp lit the room. Trophies, framed jerseys, awards, all symbols of everything he had accomplished. And yet, none of them had protected him tonight. Not from the look in that officer's eyes. Not from the cold steel of her suspicion. Not from the quiet humiliation of being seen as a threat in the place he called home. After a night that shook him to his core, Shaquille O'Neal made a decision. This wasn't going to be just another private complaint buried in silence. This time, he was going public. Like, comment, and subscribe, because what happens next could change everything. Trophies lined the shelves. Awards, certificates, accolades, all proof of a lifetime of discipline, achievement, and respect. But tonight, they felt meaningless. Hollow. Like props in a story that suddenly didn't matter anymore. Shaquille opened his laptop. His fingers moved fast across the keyboard, drafting a formal complaint against Officer Drexler. But as he typed, doubt crept in. Would this actually change anything? Would this just be another report filed, then forgotten, buried somewhere in the system? He paused, hands hovering above the keys, the anger he'd kept bottled up all night rising to the surface. This wasn't just about him. This was about every black man and woman who had been stopped, questioned, or degraded simply because of how they looked. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern. And he was done staying quiet. With a new surge of purpose, Shaquille opened a blank document and began typing again, this time, a letter to local news outlets. He detailed everything, the stop, the treatment, the humiliation. And then he called for what the system had failed to deliver, a real, open, public conversation on racial profiling. He wasn't just filing a complaint anymore. He was demanding change. He hit save and leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. The house was quiet around him, still and dark. But inside, something had shifted. He wasn't just hurt, he was ready. Ready to speak. Ready to lead. Ready to fight, not just for himself, but for everyone who didn't have a voice or platform. Outside, the street was silent. But soon, the neighbors who had watched from behind curtains would hear the truth, and this time, they wouldn't be able to look away. As Shaquille headed to bed, the anger still smoldered, but now it had direction. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. Not for revenge. For justice. For change. The next morning, he woke early. The sunlight filtering through the curtains felt different, sharper, more focused, like it was lighting a path. Shaquille's mind was already racing. The night had been long, but it had given him clarity. This wasn't about ego or pride. It was about something much bigger, the truth so many had been forced to live with for far too long. Downstairs, Maya was already moving through the kitchen. The smell of fresh coffee filled the house. The rhythm of a normal morning. But Shaquille felt anything but normal. He slipped into a crisp white shirt and dark slacks. As he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror, he saw more than an athlete. He saw an advocate. A man who had played by the rules and realized the rules were broken. This wasn't about his name anymore. It was about what his name could do. Downstairs, Maya spotted him as he descended the stairs. Her eyes scanned his face immediately. "You're leaving early," she said gently. He nodded, grabbing his briefcase. "There's something I need to take care of." She moved toward him, eyes searching his. "You're going through with it, the press, the statement?" "I have to," he said, meeting her gaze. "This isn't just about me anymore. If I don't speak up, who will?" She sighed, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "Just be careful. You know how quickly these things can spin out." He covered her hand with his, gave it a reassuring squeeze. "I know. But we can't stay quiet anymore." She nodded, though the concern in her eyes didn't fade. "Just promise me you won't carry it all alone." He kissed her forehead. "I won't," he said. But they both knew the weight was already there. As Shaquille stepped outside, the cool morning air wrapped around him. It didn't slow him down, it sharpened his focus. First stop, the local community center. He planned to go through Officer Drexler's file, collect every detail, and begin building the case. After that, another meeting with Captain Rivera, but this time, it wouldn't be a conversation. It would be a demand. Accountability. Transparency. Consequences. As he drove, Shaquille couldn't stop thinking about all the others who had been in his shoes, the ones without media platforms, lawyers, influence, or fame. The ones who were dismissed. Ignored. Silenced. How many? Too many. After being racially profiled in his own neighborhood, Shaquille O'Neal knew he couldn't stay silent. While his fame offered him some protection, it also came with responsibility. He contacted local journalists and demanded a public investigation, refusing to let the incident be buried by internal reviews. At a press conference, Shaquille recounted the humiliating stop and made it clear this wasn't about one officer, it was about a broken system that routinely targets people of color. His boldness sparked a media storm. Support poured in, but so did backlash. His son Michael faced cruel comments at school, and some residents accused Shaquille of exaggerating. Still, he stood firm, explaining to his family and the community that speaking out was necessary, even when it was uncomfortable. Despite the pressure, Shaquille pushed forward. He formed a community police task force, held town halls, and worked closely with local leaders to promote real accountability. Even Officer Drexler, after facing public scrutiny, agreed to undergo retraining and joined outreach efforts. Over time, things began to shift. Complaints of racial profiling dropped, and community events brought residents and officers together. The town was changing, slowly, but meaningfully. Shaquille continued balancing activism with his career and family life, often feeling the toll. Maya reminded him he didn't have to carry it alone. He began involving more people, turning the movement into something bigger than himself. The year ended with a powerful Unity Festival. Standing beside his family, Shaquille addressed the crowd, "This isn't the end, it's the beginning. Real change takes all of us." His actions inspired other communities to examine their own systems. And as he walked home with Maya that night, he knew this fight was for his children and for everyone who deserved to live in a world where justice was more than just a word.